morning. Welcome to Victorious Faith. I'm Cherry Campbell. Yesterday, we began a study on the death, burial, and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. Hallelujah. And I said that this is going to become the foundation of a whole new line of study that we are going to do, and we are going to build on this foundation over the next coming weeks. And so we are studying the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and we are starting with looking at the events of Resurrection Week. And we asked the question yesterday, why is it that the church has for centuries built a tradition of Jesus' death being on Friday, that Jesus died on Friday, and that's why we call it Good Friday. And again, I want to say, it's not wrong to celebrate his death on Friday. It's not wrong, because the important thing is that we do celebrate it. But we might as well understand the truth about when he actually died. And so as long as we celebrate, it's important. But let's understand a little bit more about when he died. Why do we think he died on Friday? Or why has tradition taught that he died on Friday? We looked at it yesterday in John chapter 19. John chapter 19, verse 31 says, "Now it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath, because the Jews did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath. They asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down." So we see here that the next day is going to be Sabbath. Well, this is where tradition assumed that the next day was Saturday. And because it's the seventh day of the week, the day of rest, a Sabbath day. And they assumed that it was the Sabbath day rest, or the seventh day rest. Therefore, if it was Saturday, then the day before was Friday, and so he died on Friday, the day before the Sabbath. However, that comes from not knowing and understanding the Jewish calendar and the Jewish times and the dates that God established for Israel and for the Jews. And as I said yesterday, our calendar that we use in the Western Hemisphere, it is not God's calendar. Our days are not God's days. Our months are not God's months. Our years are not God's years. He does not go by our calendar. He gave his calendar to the Jews. And as I pointed out yesterday in Genesis chapter 1, we see where God established the evening and the morning. Genesis 1:5, there was evening and there was morning the first day. Verse 8, there was evening and there was morning the second day. Verse 13, there was evening and morning the third day. Verse 19, there was evening and morning the fourth day. Verse 23, there was evening and morning the fifth day. And verse 31, there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. Notice, God declared it evening and morning. Evening first, and then morning. You see, in our culture, in the Western Hemisphere, we call a day morning and evening. We begin our day in the morning. Our day begins in the morning. Our day ends in the evening. God declared it the opposite. God said, the day begins in the evening. The day begins in the evening. And there's evening and then morning. And so on the Jewish calendar, they observe all their days and feasts and months and everything with the day beginning in the evening at sunset, or 6 o'clock p.m. 6 o'clock p.m. evening time. So their day goes from 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. And so a Sabbath even the seventh day of the week Sabbath, which we call a Saturday, it actually begins at 6 o'clock on Friday, 6 p.m. evening Friday. It goes from 6 o'clock in the evening Friday to 6 o'clock in the evening on Saturday. We've got to understand that. Whenever you read the Bible and study the Bible, and you study the days and the weeks and the months and the years, you cannot use our calendar. You've got to go back to use the calendar that God established, that God gave to Israel and commanded Israel to keep. And this is it, so that we can understand it and interpret it and know what he is saying correctly. So we see the days begin in the evening. Then let's look in Leviticus 23 again, and I'll try to review this more quickly since we went over it yesterday. But on God's calendar, they have 7 months. And actually, God's calendar is built on sevens. 7 days in a week, 7 months in a year. Basically, their calendar, they have two calendars. They have the civil calendar and the religious calendar. The religious calendar runs for 7 months. And we see it begins in the spring and ends in the fall. 7 months, starting in the spring, ending in the fall. And the spring feasts, there are 3 feasts. There is Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits. And then 50 days later, which is usually about in June, May or June on our calendar, it's the Feast of Weeks, which later the church called Pentecost. And then in the 7th month, at the end of their religious calendar year, they have the fall feasts, which are the Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, what is a Sabbath day? In Leviticus 23:3, there are 6 days when you may work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of rest, a day of sacred assembly. You are not to do any work. So a Sabbath was a day of rest, a day that they did no work, and a day of sacred assembly. Now, what I pointed out yesterday is that every feast was also a Sabbath, or it started with the Sabbath and ended with the Sabbath. For example, the Feast of Passover, the first feast, in Leviticus 23:4. It says, "These are the Lord's appointed feasts, the sacred assemblies. You are to proclaim at their appointed times." Verse 5, the Lord's Passover begins at twilight, there it is, sunset, on the 14th day of the first month. Verse 6, now this is the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The Feast of Unleavened Bread is a 7-day feast. On the 15th day of that month, the Lord's Feast of Unleavened Bread begins. For 7 days, you must eat bread without yeast. Verse 7, on the first day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. So the first day was also a special Sabbath rest. Verse 8, for 7 days, present an offering made to the Lord by fire, and on the 7th day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. So the first day and the 7th day were both special Sabbaths. It begins on the 15th day of the calendar month, but if the 15th day of the calendar month happens to be a Wednesday, because every year it's going to rotate, if it's a Wednesday, then Wednesday is a special Sabbath. They do no regular work. They hold a sacred assembly. Then they will hold the feast for 7 days, and in the middle of that, you still have Saturday, or the 7th day of the week. There's still that regular 7th day Sabbath. They will hold that. But then at the end of the feast, which would be the next Tuesday, the 7th day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it's again another Sabbath day, a day of no work and a day of sacred assembly. So we see that it begins and ends with a special Sabbath. Also, 50 days later, The Feast of Weeks, which the church calls the Feast of Pentecost. Again, in verse 21, it says, on that same day you are to proclaim a sacred assembly and do no regular work. The Feast of Weeks, which is also Pentecost, is a Sabbath, special Sabbath. So no matter what day of the week it is, whether it's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or Saturday, whatever day of the week, it's a Sabbath day. The same goes with the Feast of Trumpets, and you will see that in verse 24. Say to the Israelites on the first day of the 7th month, that's the last month of their religious calendar, you are to have a day of rest, sacred assembly, do no regular work. Verse 25. It's a Sabbath rest. And then you see the Day of Atonement in verse 27. The 10th day of the 7th month is a Day of Atonement. Hold a sacred assembly. Deny yourselves. Verse 28. Do no work on that day. So it's a Sabbath. And then also the Feast of Tabernacles, verse 34. Say to the Israelites on the 15th day of the 7th month, the Lord's Feast of Tabernacles begins. It lasts for 7 days. The first day is a sacred assembly, do no regular work. So the first day of Tabernacles is a special Sabbath. And then this one actually runs for 7 days. And then on the 8th day, they again, verse 36, on the 8th day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. So you see, each feast had special Sabbaths. So when we go back to John 19, verse 31, now it was the day of preparation. This is preparation for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And the next day was to be a special Sabbath. Notice it is not a regular Sabbath. A regular Sabbath is the 7th day of the week, what we call Saturday. It's not Saturday. It's a special Sabbath day for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so it was a special Sabbath. And therefore, because this word Sabbath was used, and the Western mind or the Western church did not realize that there are other Sabbaths, additional Sabbaths to the Saturday Sabbath, that the church then assumed that the day before the Sabbath was going to be Friday. Well, that was a wrong assumption. And as I said yesterday, even as a child, I grew up in church, born and raised in church, and I could count the days. And when Jesus said that he would be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, that when you count from Friday to Sunday, it's only 2 nights and 2 days. So it cannot be Friday when Jesus was crucified. Now, again, it's okay to celebrate on Friday. It's just fine because it's important that we are celebrating. But we might as well understand that he didn't really die on Friday. When did he die? Well, I am aware of 2 different opinions, 2 different views. And let me go over those for you. And these are just, we can ask the Lord when we get to heaven. But one view, and this is the one that I lean toward, is that the Last Supper that Jesus held with his disciples, that last meal where John the Beloved leaned his head on Jesus' shoulder, and where Judas walked out and went to the Pharisees and agreed to betray Jesus. The Last Supper, which was the Passover, was Tuesday evening. And then as the events progressed, Tuesday evening, they had the Passover starting at sunset or about 6 o'clock p.m. on Tuesday. And then after supper, the events were, they went to the Mount of Olives. They went to the Garden of Gethsemane, They crossed the Kidron Valley. Yeah, and that was on the Mount of Olives too. But then in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prayed through the night. And we'll come back to this later. You know, he sweat great drops of blood, and he was in agony. And then Jesus told his disciples to wake up. And then in the middle of the night, it was Tuesday night, early wee hours on Wednesday morning, that the soldiers came to arrest Jesus. And they arrested him, and then they brought him first before the high priest. And then the high priest sent them, they judged him in the night, and this probably was like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, Wednesday morning. And then they condemned him, they passed sentence on him, and then they took him to Pilate. Pilate talked to him, Pilate interrogated him. And at first, Pilate did not want to be the one to make the decision. So Pilate sent him over. Pilate sent him over to Herod. Herod questioned him, and not being interested in the case, sent him back to Pilate. And then Pilate was forced to make a judgment, and it was early in the morning on Wednesday morning. It was probably around 6 o'clock in the morning when Pilate made his judgment and his decision. So notice it was all through the night that Jesus was up. And actually, when they took him from the high priest to Pilate, from Pilate to Herod, from Herod back to Pilate, they had to walk. So there was walking, there was this interrogation going on for several hours in the middle of the night, probably between midnight and 6 o'clock in the morning. And it was around 6 o'clock in the morning when Pilate made his final judgment. And in John 18, verse 31, Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him." And then he actually said in chapter 19, then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. And so then he was beaten and crucified around 6 o'clock in the morning. Beaten and crucified. And then it was it says the 9th hour, from the 6th hour, from the 6th hour, we're back in Luke 23:44. It was now about the 6th hour, and darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. Now, what is the 6th hour? The Jewish day, they start the hours. Let's counting the hours now. The hours of the day goes from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. The hours of the night go from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. So when they're counting the hours, the 6th hour of the day is 12 o'clock noon, because the daylight hours are from 6 o'clock. So when they say it's the 6th hour, it is 12 o'clock noon, because it's 6 a.m. plus 6. So it's 12 noon until the 9th hour. The 9th hour is 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because it counts 9 hours from 6 a.m. And then you remember when Jesus told the parable about the landowner who went and hired workers for his vineyard even until the 11th hour? Well, the 11th hour is 5 o'clock in the afternoon, because the 12th hour is 6 o'clock. It goes from 6 to 6. So the 6th to the 9th hour means from 12 o'clock noon to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, darkness came over the whole land. And then Jesus cried out in verse 46, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." So what we see here is that there was darkness from 12 noon to 3 o'clock. The special Sabbath would begin at 6 in the evening. Darkness was from noon till 3. And after the darkness, at some point, Jesus said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. When he said this, he breathed his last. So somewhere after 3 p.m., Jesus gave up his spirit. He breathed his last between 3 and 6. The Jews wanted the bodies off the cross by 6. And actually, those who came to bury Jesus, they had to get him wrapped and put away in the tomb before 6 o'clock. Because from 6 o'clock, they could do no work. So it was probably very close to 3 in the afternoon when Jesus actually died. And then this is Wednesday when Jesus would have died. And then the special Sabbath would run from 6 p.m. Thursday until 6 p.m. 6 p.m. Wednesday to 6 p.m. Thursday. 6 p.m. Wednesday until 6 p.m. Thursday. And then they would have 24 hours from 6 p.m. Thursday until 6 p.m. Friday. Because at 6 p.m. Friday, the regular seventh-day Sabbath begins. They would have 24 hours to do some work in there. Now, that's one view. Another view I've also heard taught is that instead of Tuesday being the Passover, Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples, it was Wednesday. And this is another option, another possibility, that it was Wednesday evening when Jesus celebrated the Passover with his disciples starting at 6 p.m., and then Wednesday night, Thursday morning, and actually the wee hours Thursday morning from midnight till 6, when he was being tried and judged and then sentenced, and about 6 a.m. Thursday, he was beaten and then taken and hung on the cross. And then Thursday noon to 3 p.m., there was darkness. And then Thursday about 3 p.m., he died because the special Sabbath would begin at 6 p.m. Thursday, in which they could do no work. So that he had to be in the tomb before 6 p.m. Thursday. Now, what that would do would make the special Sabbath running the day before the weekly Sabbath. So it would be 6 p.m. Thursday to 6 p.m. Friday being the special Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but then 6 p.m. Friday to 6 p.m. Saturday being the weekly Sabbath. So there would actually be 48 hours in a row, 2 days in a row of Sabbath days that they could do no work, in which case the women could not prepare spices until after 6 p.m. on Saturday. Now, if that's the case, they had to prepare the spices after 6 p.m. Saturday. If Jesus was crucified Wednesday and the special Sabbath was from Wednesday night to Thursday night, then there was Thursday night to Friday night, 6 p.m. Thursday to 6 p.m. Friday, when they could have had time for preparation of the spices. Now, I have not studied the spices and what it takes and how many hours that would take. If it takes a lot of time, if it takes a whole day, then that's why I would lean toward him being crucified Wednesday. If it would take a whole day to prepare those spices, they would have to have that day from 6 p.m. Thursday to 6 p.m. Friday. But if it can be done in a fairly short amount of time, or if they could do it through the night, Saturday night, it is possible that they prepared their spices after 6 p.m. Saturday. Now, I hope you've understood these things. I will try to say it again more clearly tomorrow. We're out of time right now for today. And so I just want to make the announcement again that on Saturday, May 3rd, is our next Victorious Faith seminar starting at 6:30 p.m. and it goes till about 8:30. And we have praise and worship, and then we have a message, and we just fellowship together. We worship the Lord together and hear the word of God together to build your faith. Every one of these seminars is focused on a topic to build your faith, And so come and join us. We would love to have you. That again will be at the Comfort Suites at I-25 in Dry Creek, 1 block east of I-25, and actually about 2 blocks north of Dry Creek. And then the following Saturday, May 10, is our next, our first ladies' breakfast meeting. And I will be ministering. We will also have a praise and worship leader with us. And I will be ministering from Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, where it says, God created man in his own image and in his own likeness, and he made them male and female, that the woman is also created in the image of God. And so this is a good, encouraging message for women and also for men too. But at this time, it's for the ladies, and the breakfast is only $8.50. It's going to be at the Country Buffet at Quebec and C470. You can go to my website, www.victoriousfaith.co, or you can write to me at info@victoriousfaith.co for more information. And until tomorrow, remember, God loves you, you are blessed and highly favored by the Lord.